Greetings and welcome back to CS195 Web Development, Week 4, more HTML tags, and this lesson we're going over CSS Grouping Elements. And these are still tags, it's just normally, and this is why they're the last thing we're going to learn right before we get into CSS, more advanced CSS. They're used so you can use CSS. I mean, really, other than that, they don't really do anything other than allow you to group them, group other elements, group text, so that you can use CSS on them. So if you remember from last lesson, we learned how to add an internal link. So with that, what's the difference between an internal link and an external link? All right, pause, think about it in your head. Hopefully you came up with it right. The external link takes you to a different page. It might be on the same web server, like Google to Google Docs, or it might be from Google to Amazon, right? Those are external links, whereas an internal just goes to somewhere else on that page. So like I click here and it just scrolls me down to lower on the page. So with this grouping, our objective is to understand how to group elements together and then why you would need to do that, right? Well, because again, we'll talk about that whole using it with CSS because it doesn't do anything. At the end of the lesson, we'll have con challenge. Our success criteria: students will demonstrate adding proper HTML to group elements together and then add a CSS rule that changes a CSS value of a parent element in order to change the font of the child element. Basically, you are going to wrap a tag around other elements so that that will become the parent element. When you add CSS to it, it will change everything below it. So that's the kicker of what we're trying to do, right? Is being able to group these pieces so that you can use them. So let's go to the con video and we can see what are the elements we use this for, and then how is it used.
So far, we've seen how you can use CSS to style your text, but we can also use CSS to completely change the layout of our page. That means we can move things around, change their size, even put them on top of each other. But what are the things we want to move around? Sometimes there are elements that we've already made, like a certain paragraph or a certain heading. But oftentimes there are a group of elements that we've made, like a selection of text or a heading and a few paragraphs. In order to move them around together as a unit, we need to introduce two new HTML tags, which we call the grouping elements. We didn't talk about them before CSS because they're only useful when combined with CSS. They have no semantic meaning to the browser. The first tag is the span tag, and it's what we use for grouping a selection of text.
All right, so the first tag is the span tag, and it's just going to group text. So we'll see how she does the span tag, but it works like every other tag. You open it and you close it around what you want to.
Let's say we want to color this word love red, and we just want to color the word, not the rest of the heading. We'll put our cursor before love, type the start tag for span, put it after, type the end tag. Okay, now we want...
All right, so let's look at this real quick. This is what I talk about. It does nothing. This word love is this right here. Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. So this is what I was talking about. But it group them all together. So if you want to change just this, we know how to change all of it, right? If we give, in fact, we just select all the H3s, or we can give this an ID or a class and then change the color. But that's going to do everything inside of the H3. What span's allowing us to do is just select this one word.
We want to style this span of characters. We could make a rule to color all spans on the page, but we may not want them all to be red. Let's give the span a class of lovey-dovey and add a rule just for elements that have the class lovey-dovey. So dot lovey-dovey, color red.
All right, notice she added the style tag, which is inside of the head tag. And then she built her rule. Remember, selector, it's been CSS a while for CSS, so selector, and then what you're changing, right? The property and the value. And you also
look how lovey-dovey that text is now. So spans are good for grouping selections of text. How do we group a bunch of elements together?
All right, so first, again, you could use a span to just do one letter. I mean, that is how precise you can get. So see, just the L is red now. You can get very precise. So the next thing she's going to go over is, what if I want to do all of this? Or I want to group all of this together, whatever she's trying to group. That's where this next one comes in. That's what she's talking about.
That's where the div tag comes in. Let's say we want to group this bottom section, the official info header and the paragraphs and picture below it. To do that, I'll put my cursor before the H3 and do the start tag for div, and then go down to the final paragraph and write the end tag for div. We have a div, now we need to style it. To style the div, I'm going to give it an ID, official info, and then add a rule for it up here. So hash official info and background, and let's make it a nice gray. Let's pick out, that's good. So now you can see the div has become a gray box containing all of the elements inside of it. And it's different from if we'd given each of them a gray background separately. If we did that, there'd be a space in between them that wouldn't go gray. We have to make a div if we want to box around everything. You can think of span as being for grouping text, and you can think of div for grouping elements. But there's another way to distinguish them as well. You see, there are two types of elements in the CSS world, inline and block. An inline element does not have a new line after it. Like if you make multiple of them, they'll all be on the same line. A few examples we've talked about are A and image.
So what she's saying is, see how the text next to cat goes right next to it, but whenever you do like an H1, everything goes below it or above it. Like this is H3, above or below. So as soon as you put that in there, it makes it thing. So that's what she's talking about. Inline. This is inline. The picture is inline. If I want the picture to have a line after it, I got to add that break, right? This is the new line tag. And see, now the word goes below it, but by default, it goes in line with it. And of course, we want this as well for our tags. Could you imagine if you had these tags as an H, any of the H's? I mean, it's going to go crazy when it doesn't actually match up with what you're trying to do. So this is what happens. So it was in line, and then what she's going to say, this is block, right? So, and we're going to go into a whole section down here on the box model, but everything is its own block. Now, whether that block be, like in this case, its own little square, or in the case of this is still a little square, right? This tag, it's just, here is the square. Right there, that's the square. It's in line with this square right behind it. So that's something to think about when you go through this, is there's inline and block. Div is a block. So if I would have just gave this a div as well, if I would have said div here, it will give that same result as adding H1 there, because again, it is block. So now it's all the way across. This whole thing is the block, as opposed to when it was in line, it just boom, right there. So that's what she's talking about.
And you can see with this image how it just runs into the text next to it. There's no new line after it. A block element does have a new line after it, and that is what most HTML tags create. Look at all the examples on this page. The headings, the paragraphs, the lists. The browser put new lines after all of them without you needing to write a BR tag. What does that have to do with span and div? Well, a span creates an inline element, and a div creates a block element. That means that if you add a div and don't add any other style, the browser will blockify that part of the page. Like that bit of text I just wrapped in a div now has new lines before and after. And maybe that's what you want. Just keep this difference in mind and keep going, because...
All right, so let's go ahead and try this out with understanding. Again, spans are for words, and then the div is for whole groups of it. So this is what we want to do. We're going to group all of these together because, and again, we got to remember these are simple examples. I could obviously just do the p tag just as easy, but I'm going to put a div here in order to go ahead and show you they can group it, and they can be different things. If there was a h2 in here and whatnot. So let's go ahead. I'm going to full screen this so you can actually see it, and then you don't need much of over here. So I mean, I could go ahead and do that right now. Let's add a h2 here, h2 second header, or heading, let's call it. They're the same thing. But so let's start with the span. We go here, and we're going to get, and we're going to put a span. And remember, in this one, it automatically closes. So if I want get, I can drag it in there, or I can also grab the span, drag it outside, and you can also cut and paste, copy paste, whatever you need to do. I already have the style tag here. Let's give this an ID. And let's just call it get, because we're going to change the get. Tab, tab, tab. We're in the right location here. And to get an ID, what symbol do we use? Say it in your head, out loud. Hashtag, right? So hashtag get, squiggly bracket, enter. And then let's do color green. And there you go, right there. Get is now green. Hopefully you can see that color. Let's make it red, maybe more visible. There you go. Okay, so you should clearly be able to see that it's red now. We're going to set ourselves up for another rule. So after the squiggly bracket, we're going to hit enter, and that's going to be a second rule. And let's add a div around all of this. So again, we type in div. It automatically closes. I'm going to drag it to the end, and I'm going to indent. Now, these are now inside of a div. So you can highlight them all and hit tab, and it'll indent all of them so it's inside of it. And just see how clean this is. It's really easy to see that all of these are inside of it. If this was like back here and you had hundreds of lines of code, you're going to be like, what's going on? Where's the end of it? I mean, it's going to be really, really hard to see your code as you have hundreds and hundreds of lines of code for your final project. You're going to want this nice, clean syntax. But anyway, let's give this one a class because we're going to use this more. So let's give it, attribute equals quotes. Let's give it a class of section, because we're going to, in theory, we could keep adding more and more sections and so on and so forth, and then they'd all get that information. So how do we select a class? That's right, period, section, squiggly bracket, enter, and then let's give it color blue. And you can see that very clearly. Both of those sections are blue. If we add another div here, and we add a third section, if we don't give it the class of section, it's not going to. In fact, if we give it the ID of get, we're going to make it red. And this is where it's broken. Remember, you're not supposed to actually have to get. So this is where you can get weird situations. I'm actually going to delete this one. Just the get from this. And you might need to do that too. It all depends on how the browser. You might have a different browser than I'm using. It's going to pick whatever it wants to pick. So don't give it the same ID. I'm going to give this one span now. And it's not going to do anything because I don't actually have a rule for it. So go ahead, give it a rule. Give this a rule, and you can change it. Go ahead and give it a background. That helps you see block a lot better. All right, so hopefully you already did that. You've paused it. You've come back. Again, hashtag selects it, span, squiggly bracket, enter, back, ground. Oh my gosh, colon, pink. And that. Remember how we said this was inline, but everything is essentially a block, a box? That is its box. That is the box. That is the span. And if we gave anything else a background, you would see exactly what the block is. So it's important to see that. So we can see this with all of them. Let's do just all the p tags. And you probably at this point don't need to be typing this. This is just for demonstration. But let's give this a background so we can see this concept a little bit better. Let's do blue. No, that's going to make everything go away. Oops. Green. And there you go. See how the paragraphs, they are their own block as well. And notice how there's space in between them, right? So the paragraphs don't actually cover that as well. So this is a good important thing to understand. When you add a div to surround them all, it went ahead and surrounded them all. It takes in that whole entire block, and then there's still boxes inside of each of those. So that's pretty much it. You just surround whatever you want to surround, give it an ID or class, and then apply the formatting to it. We'll use this later for moving text around and moving objects around. So like I can actually take this and move it off to the side. But that's for another day. Hopefully you got everything you need to. Go ahead, take the challenge, do the journal entry, and we will see you next lesson.